The sound of cracking twigs pierced the stillness of the forest as Jenna's boots sank into the damp earth. She adjusted her backpack and glanced over her shoulder. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving the woods bathed in an eerie blue twilight. She was on the tail end of a solo hiking trip in Blackwater Woods, a vast and secluded forest known for its dense trees and unmarked trails. What was supposed to be a weekend getaway to clear her head was quickly turning into a nightmare. Jenna cursed herself for losing the trail. Hours earlier, she had veered off the marked path to explore a curious clearing she had spotted in the distance. The clearing, dominated by a massive oak tree with twisting, unnatural branches, felt like it belonged in another time. The air around it was unsettlingly quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, but she shrugged it off and continued deeper into the woods, curious about what lay beyond. By the time she realized she was lost, the daylight was already fading. Jenna tried retracing her steps, but every tree, every rock, every fallen log looked the same. Her phone had no signal, and the low battery warning had begun to blink ominously. She resolved to keep moving until she found a sign of civilization, anything that might guide her back. That was when the first sound came, a low, guttural growl, too close for comfort. Jenna froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as she scanned the trees, but the dim light made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The growl came again, deeper this time, resonating like a warning. She tightened her grip on the walking stick she carried and forced herself to take slow, deliberate steps forward. The forest seemed alive with whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind weaving through the trees, but the sounds grew clearer, muted voices murmuring words she couldn't understand. Jenna's heart pounded as her mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe she had stumbled too close to a campsite. Maybe the growl was just a bear. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. A sharp, metallic snap echoed through the woods, followed by a faint but unmistakable scream. It was high-pitched and cut off abruptly, like the cry of a small animal, or something much worse. Jenna started to run. Her feet pounded the earth as branches tore at her jacket and face. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in an unintelligible cacophony that seemed to be coming from every direction. Panic tightened her chest, but she couldn't stop. She broke into another clearing, but this one was wrong. The trees surrounding it were twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened as if scorched by fire. Strange symbols had been carved into their trunks, crude and chaotic, as if etched by something with claws instead of hands. In the center of the clearing was a pile of rocks. No, bones. Human bones. Jenna staggered backward, her stomach twisting in horror. A sound behind her made her whip around. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form barely human. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Help me," it whispered, though its lips didn't move. The voice echoed in her mind, cold and invasive. Jenna screamed and bolted, her survival instincts taking over. She didn't look back, even as she heard the rapid thudding of something chasing her, its footfalls unnervingly fast and uneven. The forest seemed to shift as she ran, the trees closing in and the terrain becoming more treacherous. Her legs burned and her lungs ached, but she didn't dare slow down. Just as she thought she couldn't run any farther, she burst onto a dirt road. A pair of headlights blinded her, and she collapsed, waving her arms weakly as a truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a grizzled old man, jumped out and ran to her side. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Something's in there," Jenna gasped, pointing toward the forest. But when she turned to look, the woods were silent and still. There was no sign of the creature, no sign of the clearing, nothing but darkness. The man helped her into the truck and drove her to the nearest town, where she collapsed into the safety of a motel bed. Jenna tried to convince herself it was all in her head, a trick of exhaustion and fear. But later that night, as she lay staring at the ceiling, she heard it again, the low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside her window. The snow had just begun to fall when Mark, a seasoned outdoorsman, and his younger sister Claire arrived at the edge of Deep Hollow Woods. The forest was notorious, but not for the usual ghost stories or legends. It was said that people went in and never came out. Some blamed the terrain, others wild animals, but the locals told darker tales of figures lurking in the shadows and voices that led travelers astray. Mark brushed off the warnings. He had hiked tougher terrain and seen his fair share of wilderness dangers. Claire was less certain, but she trusted her brother, and besides, the allure of untouched nature was too tempting to resist. The first few hours of their trek were uneventful. The snow thickened, blanketing the forest in a pristine silence. Their boots crunched softly against the ground as they admired the towering trees and the occasional animal tracks. But as the sun began its descent, the mood shifted. It started with the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the wilderness, but a suffocating stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their breathing and footsteps. Claire mentioned it first. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. "Hear what?" Mark replied, though he already knew what she meant. The absence of sound was unnatural. Then came the whispers. At first, it was faint, so soft that Claire thought she was imagining it. But soon, both of them could hear it. Indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise and fall, always just beyond the range of understanding. They stopped and turned, searching for the source, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once. "It's probably just the wind," Mark said, though his grip on the map tightened. Claire didn't buy it. Wind doesn't sound like people. They pressed on, hoping to find a clearing to set up camp before nightfall. But the forest had other plans. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches intertwining overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The whispers grew louder, morphing into snatches of words. Claire swore she heard her name. By the time night fell, they were hopelessly lost. Mark tried to navigate by the stars, but the sky was obscured by thick clouds. The snow had covered their tracks, and every direction looked the same. They decided to make camp, but unease gnawed at them. As they set up the tent, Claire noticed something strange. The snow around them was undisturbed, except for one set of footprints leading into the woods. They were large, barefoot, and fresh. "Mark," she whispered, pointing to the tracks. He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. "It's probably an animal," he said, though he didn't believe it. The shape of the prints was wrong. Too human, but with elongated toes that dug deep into the snow. That night, sleep was impossible. The whispers grew louder, circling the tent like an unseen predator. At one point, Mark swore he heard laughter, deep, guttural, and cruel. Claire clung to him, her nails digging into his arm. Around midnight, the tent zipper began to move. Mark grabbed his hunting knife, his heart pounding as he shone his flashlight toward the sound. The zipper inched down slowly, as if whatever was outside wanted to savor their fear. But when he flung the tent flap open, there was nothing there, just the endless forest and those damn footprints. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder, calling out in voices that mimicked loved ones. Mark's late father, Claire's childhood friend who had died years ago. The voices pleaded for help, begged them to step outside, promised safety if they just followed. By dawn, they couldn't take it anymore. They packed up and started moving, desperate to escape the cursed woods. But no matter which direction they chose, they always ended up back at the same clearing with the same footprints. The forest was toying with them. It wasn't until the third day that Claire disappeared. Mark had turned his back for only a moment. When he called her name, there was no reply, just the oppressive silence and the faint crunch of snow in the distance. He ran in the direction of the sound, screaming her name, but all he found was her scarf snagged on a branch, soaked in blood. Mark searched for hours, days even, though he could no longer tell how much time had passed. The forest seemed endless, the whispers ceaseless. Eventually, he stopped shouting, stopped running. He knew he would never leave. The forest had claimed him too. A week later, a rescue team found Mark's body near the edge of the woods. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. They never found Claire. But when one of the rescuers looked deeper into the trees, he swore he saw a pale figure watching, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway for Emily, her boyfriend Chris, and their friends Rachel and Mike. They had rented a remote cabin deep in the Pine Barrens, a sprawling forest in New Jersey, infamous for its dark history and eerie legends. The plan was to unplug, enjoy some fresh air, and tell campfire stories. None of them believed in the tales of the Jersey Devil or the strange disappearances that dotted the region's past. That was until the first night. The group arrived at dusk. The cabin was rustic but charming, perched on the edge of a thick grove of trees. As they unpacked, Rachel noticed an old faded map nailed to the wall by the fireplace. It was crudely drawn, marking out trails and landmarks, but something about it was unsettling. Scrawled at the bottom in jagged handwriting were the words, "Stay on the paths. Never follow the lights." "Creepy decoration," Rachel said, laughing nervously as she turned away. Dinner passed uneventfully, and they settled around the fire pit outside to share ghost stories. Chris went first, spinning a tale about a phantom hitchhiker, followed by Rachel's story about an abandoned asylum. The group laughed and teased each other, their voices echoing through the trees. Then Mike decided to tell the legend of the lights. "You've all heard about the Jersey Devil, right?" he began. "Well, that's not the scariest thing in these woods. There are these lights. People call them ghost lights or will-o'-the-wisps. They say if you follow them, you'll never come back." "Sounds like a load of crap," Chris said, chuckling. Mike shrugged. "Maybe. But people have gone missing out here. Hikers, hunters, campers. Some of them say they saw lights before they vanished. Weird, flickering lights that lead you deeper and deeper into the woods." "That's just swamp gas or something," Emily chimed in, though her voice lacked conviction. They laughed it off and eventually headed to bed. The forest outside the cabin was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if something was listening. Emily woke in the middle of the night to the sound of faint tapping. She lay still, heart pounding, straining to hear. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. She turned her head slowly toward the window. A light flickered in the darkness. It was faint, hovering just beyond the tree line. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the light swayed, almost playfully. She blinked, and when her eyes adjusted, she realized there were more of them, small, glowing orbs floating in the distance. They pulsed gently, as if alive. "Chris," she whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned, turning over. "What?" "Look," she said, pointing to the window. Chris sat up groggily, squinting at the lights. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Emily whispered. "Should we wake the others?" Before they could decide, the lights began to move, drifting deeper into the forest. Something about the way they swayed was hypnotic, almost inviting. Without thinking, Chris stood and grabbed his jacket. "Wait, where are you going?" Emily hissed. "I just want to see what it is," he said, his voice oddly calm. "Are you crazy? Mike literally told a story about this. It's probably just kids messing around," Chris said, opening the door. Emily watched in horror as he stepped outside and started toward the lights. "Chris!" she called, but he didn't turn back. He walked as if in a trance, his figure swallowed by the darkness. Panicking, Emily ran to wake Rachel and Mike. "Chris is gone!" she cried. He followed the lights. Rachel and Mike bolted upright, their faces pale with fear. Grabbing flashlights, the three of them rushed outside, calling Chris's name. The forest was dark and oppressive, their voices swallowed by the trees. Then they saw them, the lights. They were closer now, bobbing and weaving between the trunks like fireflies. But there was something wrong about them. They didn't flicker naturally. They pulsed in unison, as if responding to some unseen command. "Chris!" Rachel shouted. There was no answer. They followed the lights deeper into the woods, their flashlights casting frantic beams across the undergrowth. Emily's stomach churned with unease. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened as if burned. The ground was soft, almost wet, and the air reeked of decay. "Wait," Mike said suddenly, stopping. "Do you hear that?" They fell silent. At first there was nothing. Then came the sound, a low, guttural hum, like 100 voices murmuring at once. It came from everywhere and nowhere. "We need to go back," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Now." But before they could turn, the lights flared, blinding them. Emily shielded her eyes, and when the brightness dimmed, the lights were gone. So was Mike. "Mike!" Rachel screamed, spinning in circles. The forest was empty. Emily grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her back toward the cabin. "We have to get out of here!" They ran, crashing through the trees, but the forest seemed endless. No matter how far they went, they couldn't find the trail. The murmuring grew louder, and the air turned icy. Emily felt as though invisible hands were brushing against her, pulling her back. Finally, they broke through the tree line and saw the cabin. They bolted inside, slamming the door and locking it. The whispers stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Morning came slowly, and with it, a grim discovery. Chris and Mike's footprints led into the woods but never came out. Search parties found no trace of them, just an old, faded map nailed to the cabin wall, the words scrawled at the bottom now burned into Emily's memory. Stay on the paths, never follow the lights. The town of Ashford was known for two things, its sprawling forest and its chilling local legend, the Hollow Man. Nobody could agree on where the story started, but every child in town grew up hearing the same warning. Don't go into the woods alone at night, or the Hollow Man will find you. No one had seen him and lived to tell the tale, but the accounts were always the same. A tall figure, impossibly thin, with hollow, glowing eyes, and a face that looked like stretched, pale leather. He didn't walk, he glided, and his voice, when he spoke, was said to be a low, hypnotic hum that could draw you into the depths of the forest where you'd never be found. Most people dismissed it as a ghost story, but not everyone. There were whispers about those who had vanished in the woods, hunters, hikers, even children. The bodies were never recovered. Hannah had never believed in the Hollow Man. She'd grown up hearing the stories and rolling her eyes at them. But now, standing at the edge of the woods on a bitter October night, the words of her late grandmother echoed in her mind. He only comes when you're alone. It had started as a dare. Hannah's friends, drunk on cheap beer and teenage bravado, had challenged her to go into the woods and bring back a branch from the old willow tree at its heart. The tree was supposedly cursed, another piece of the legend. The forest was silent as she stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the dense shadows. She followed the faint trail, the cold air biting at her skin. Every crunch of leaves underfoot made her flinch. After a few minutes, the trail began to fade, swallowed by the undergrowth. Hannah paused, glancing back, but the way she'd come already looked unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer now, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward her. "That's what you get for drinking," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. Then she heard it. A faint hum, low and rhythmic, like the sound of a distant machine. It didn't belong in the forest. She swung her flashlight around, but the beam only revealed endless trees. The hum grew louder, resonating in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. As she turned to keep walking, she saw it. Just for a moment at the edge of her vision, a tall, thin shadow slipping between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's just your imagination," she whispered. "It's just a shadow." But the hum didn't stop. It was closer now, a pulsing vibration that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Her hands shook as she gripped the flashlight tighter and quickened her pace. That was when she saw the willow tree. Its gnarled branches twisted skyward, and its bark was blackened and peeling, as if burned. A strange smell lingered around it, metallic, sharp, like blood. Hannah broke a small branch and stuffed it into her pocket, eager to leave. But as she turned, her flashlight caught something on the ground. She crouched down, her stomach churning. It was a shoe. Old, tattered, but unmistakably human. Her mind raced. Maybe it was left by a hiker. Maybe it was nothing. But then the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. She stood, every instinct screaming for her to run, when a voice broke the stillness. "Hannah!" Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't a scream or a shout. It was a whisper, soft and intimate, like someone standing right behind her. She spun around, but the forest was empty. Then she saw it. A figure stood between the trees, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and its face was hollow, a stretched canvas of pale skin with no features, but a faint indentation where a mouth should be. Hannah froze, unable to move, her legs like stone. The figure began to glide toward her, its body shifting unnaturally, like it was being pulled on invisible strings. "Hannah," it whispered again, the sound coming from nowhere and everywhere. She bolted. Branches whipped at her face and arms as she ran blindly through the woods, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The hum had returned, louder now, vibrating in her skull. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it following her, feel its hollow gaze boring into her back. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept running until she saw the edge of the woods. Relief surged through her, but just as she reached the clearing, something cold and sharp brushed her shoulder. She screamed and stumbled forward, collapsing onto the grass. When she looked back, the forest was still, silent. Her friends found her an hour later, sitting on the ground, clutching the willow branch like a lifeline. She didn't tell them what happened. She didn't need to. They saw the look in her eyes and knew something had gone terribly wrong. Hannah never went into the woods again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind was still, she swore she could hear the hum. The old Miller house had been abandoned for decades, a decaying mansion hidden deep in the woods outside of town. Kids dared each other to visit it every Halloween, but few were brave enough to step foot inside. The locals whispered that the place was cursed, that anyone who entered would hear the clockmaker, a ghostly figure said to haunt the house, counting down the seconds until your doom. Jess didn't believe in ghosts. A practical, no-nonsense college student, she laughed off the stories when her friends brought them up one crisp October night. "It's just a bunch of superstitious nonsense," she said, finishing her beer. Her friend Eric grinned. "If it's nonsense, why don't you prove it? Go inside. Spend the night." The others cheered, egging her on, and before she knew it, Jess found herself standing in front of the Miller house, her backpack stuffed with snacks, a flashlight, and her phone. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the place seemed to breathe with its own eerie life. "I'll see you all in the morning," she said, forcing a grin as she stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and something faintly metallic. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. Jess shone her flashlight around, taking in the tattered curtains and peeling wallpaper. A grandfather clock stood in the corner of the foyer, its face cracked and its pendulum motionless. She set up her sleeping bag in the parlor and started exploring. Most of the rooms were empty, save for broken furniture and forgotten junk. But as she climbed the stairs, she began to notice something strange. There were clocks everywhere, on the walls, on mantels, even lying shattered on the floor. None of them worked. The deeper she went into the house, the more unsettling it became. In one bedroom, she found a small doll sitting upright on the bed, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. In another, a mirror hung crookedly, the glass fogged with grime. She wiped it clean, only to see a shadow pass behind her reflection. Jess spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her heart pounded, but she shook her head. "Just your imagination," she muttered. It wasn't until she returned to the parlor that she heard it, a faint, rhythmic ticking. She froze, her flashlight beam darting across the room. The grandfather clock in the foyer was still broken, its hands frozen at midnight. The ticking grew louder, echoing through the house. Jess tried to laugh it off. "Old pipes," she said aloud, though her voice trembled. But the sound didn't stop. It grew sharper, faster, like a countdown. Suddenly her phone buzzed. She nearly jumped out of her skin as she pulled it from her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "Tick-tock!" Her stomach dropped. She turned her phone off and shoved it into her bag, but the ticking was now deafening, filling her ears and vibrating in her chest. "Who's there?" she shouted, spinning in circles. The room seemed darker now, the air heavier. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. She turned her flashlight toward the far wall, and there it was. A figure stood in the shadows, impossibly tall and thin. Its face was obscured by a mask shaped like a clock, the hands spinning wildly. Long, skeletal fingers reached toward her, ticking with every movement. Jess screamed and stumbled backward, her flashlight dropping to the floor. The figure didn't walk. It glided toward her, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. "Time's up," it whispered in a voice that seemed to come from inside her own head. She ran, her breath ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls narrowing, the hallways stretching. Every door she tried was locked, the ticking now a roar. Finally, she burst into the foyer and grabbed the front door handle. It wouldn't budge. She pulled and kicked, sobbing, but the door remained sealed. Behind her, the figure loomed, its clock face now glowing faintly. It raised one bony hand and pointed to the grandfather clock, which was now ticking furiously. Its hands spun faster and faster until they stopped at 3. The final chime echoed through the house, and everything went black. The next morning, Eric and the others found Jess's car parked where she had left it, but the Miller house was silent. They searched for hours, but found no sign of her, no sleeping bag, no flashlight, nothing. In the foyer, however, the broken grandfather clock was working again. Its hands were frozen at 3, and when they listened closely, they swore they could still hear faint ticking, as if the house itself was counting down to its next victim. In the remote wilderness of Blackwood Forest, there was a stretch of road known as Widow's Hollow. No one drove it after dark if they could help it. The stories surrounding the hollow were as old as the forest itself. Strange lights, unearthly howls, and shadowy figures that darted between the trees. But the most persistent tale was that of the weeping woman. People claimed to see her standing by the roadside, a pale figure in a tattered dress, her head bowed as she sobbed. Those who stopped to help her were never seen again. Some said she was the ghost of a widow who had lost her family in the forest long ago. Others believed she was something older, something far more sinister, wearing the guise of a grieving woman. Ben didn't believe any of it. A long-haul trucker by trade, Ben had spent countless nights driving lonely roads and had heard every ghost story imaginable. He prided himself on his nerves of steel, laughing off the tales of Widow's Hollow as small-town nonsense. One cold November night, with a storm rolling in, Ben found himself behind schedule. His usual route was closed for construction, forcing him to take the detour through Blackwood Forest. By the time he reached Widow's Hollow, the rain was falling in sheets and visibility was nearly zero. The road was narrow and winding, the forest pressing in on both sides like a living wall. Ben's headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the rhythmic thud of his windshield wipers was the only sound besides the growl of his engine. As he rounded a bend, his heart skipped a beat. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. It was a woman, drenched from the rain, her long hair plastered to her face. She wore a white dress, the fabric torn and stained with mud. Her shoulders shook as if she were crying. Ben cursed under his breath, slamming on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop mere feet from her. She didn't flinch. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight. He rolled down the window, rain pelting his face. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Her head remained bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Ben hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay in the truck, but he couldn't just leave her there. Against his better judgment, he opened the door and stepped out. The cold rain soaked him instantly, and he had to shield his eyes from the downpour. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Do you need help?" Still no response. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. Her feet were bare, and they didn't quite touch the ground. "Jesus," Ben whispered, stopping in his tracks. The woman's sobbing ceased abruptly. Slowly, she raised her head. Her face was ghastly pale, her eyes hollow and black as the night around them. When she smiled, her lips stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and impossibly sharp. Ben stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand. The woman let out a piercing scream that wasn't human, a sound like metal tearing and wind howling through a graveyard. She lunged at him, moving with unnatural speed. He turned and bolted for the truck, his boots slipping on the slick pavement. He could hear her behind him, her laughter high and shrill, echoing through the hollow. The truck loomed ahead like a lifeline, and he threw himself into the cab, slamming the door just as her pale hand slapped against the window. Ben didn't look back. He threw the truck into gear and floored it, the engine roaring as he sped down the treacherous road. In his rearview mirror, he saw her standing in the middle of the road, watching him with that terrible smile. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until the storm swallowed her whole. By the time Ben reached the next town, he was shaking. He parked at a diner and stumbled inside, dripping wet and pale as a ghost. The waitress took one look at him and brought him a strong cup of coffee. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Ben looked up, startled. "What?" "The weeping woman," she said. "You're lucky to be alive. Most who see her don't make it out of that forest." Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could hear was her scream, echoing in his ears, and the memory of her hollow, black eyes boring into his soul. He never drove through Widow's Hollow again, and on the rare occasions when he told the story, he always ended with the same warning. If you see her, don't stop. No matter what you do, don't stop. The village of Coldridge was nestled in the shadow of the ironwood forest, a dense and ancient stretch of trees where sunlight rarely reached the ground. For centuries, villagers had whispered about the forest's dark guardian, a creature they called the Watcher. It was said to be older than the trees themselves, a being of shadows and hunger that punished those who trespassed too deeply into its domain. The warnings were simple: never go into the forest at night and never speak the Watcher's name aloud. Evan, a skeptic by nature, had just moved to Coldridge from the city. He was a writer hoping to find inspiration in the quiet village. He had no patience for the superstitions of the locals, who constantly warned him about the forest. To him, it was just a patch of woods, nothing more. One chilly evening, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. The sun was setting, casting the trees in long, eerie shadows, but Evan didn't care. He'd been walking the forest trail since he'd arrived, and nothing had ever happened. As he wandered deeper, the air grew colder and the trees seemed to press closer together. The trail became less distinct, the ground soft and damp beneath his feet. Evan frowned, realizing he'd lost his way. The sky above was quickly darkening, and he hadn't thought to bring a flashlight. "Great," he muttered, turning in what he hoped was the right direction. That was when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound like heavy footsteps echoing through the trees. Evan froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He strained his ears, but the forest had fallen deathly silent. No wind, no birds, just an oppressive stillness. He shook his head, laughing nervously. "It's just an animal," he said aloud, though his voice sounded small and uncertain. The footsteps came again, closer this time. They were slow and deliberate, each one accompanied by the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs. Evan's mouth went dry. He couldn't see anything in the encroaching darkness, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was following him. He began to walk faster, his breath visible in the icy air. The footsteps matched his pace, never hurrying, but always keeping close. He broke into a jog, then a sprint, weaving through the trees, desperate to find the trail. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. Finally, he saw it. A faint glow through the trees. Relief surged through him as he realized it was the light from his cottage. He burst through the edge of the forest, stumbling onto the dirt road, and didn't stop running until he slammed the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, panting, his body trembling with adrenaline. "It's nothing," he told himself. "You spooked yourself, that's all." But as he turned toward the window, his blood ran cold. A figure stood at the tree line, just beyond the reach of the light. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and wrong, its body cloaked in shifting shadows. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness, but Evan felt its gaze on him, heavy and consuming, like it could see straight into his soul. The Watcher. Evan stumbled back, pulling the curtains shut. He fumbled for his phone, dialing the local sheriff, but the line crackled with static. Every light in the cottage flickered, then died, plunging him into darkness. A faint tapping came from the window. Evan backed away, his heart hammering. No, this isn't real. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then came the voice, low and guttural, like the creak of ancient wood. "Why have you come?" it whispered. "Why have you broken the silence?" Evan clapped his hands over his ears, but the voice was inside his head now, reverberating like an echo in a cave. "You were warned," it said. "Now you are mine." The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of something dragging across the walls. Evan's chest tightened as he realized it was circling the house, looking for a way in. He ran to the front door, throwing the deadbolt, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen. The dragging sound stopped. Silence fell once more. Evan held his breath, listening, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. He crept toward the window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver. The yard was empty. The forest loomed beyond, silent and still. Maybe it was over. Then, from the shadows of the living room, came the whisper, "I am already inside." The next morning, the villagers found Evan's cottage empty. The door was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a struggle. No footprints, no blood, no clue as to where he had gone. All that remained was his notebook, left open on the table. Scrawled across the pages, over and over, in frantic, looping handwriting, were 3 words, "The Watcher comes." The villagers knew what it meant. The forest had claimed another, and so they said their prayers and returned to their quiet lives, careful not to stray too close to the trees, and never speaking the Watcher's name. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a cabin that no one stayed in twice. Locals called it The Hollow Point. It was a small, rickety structure, forgotten on the edge of an abandoned hiking trail. Rumor had it that the cabin was cursed, that anyone who stayed there would hear whispers in the night and never be the same again. Jake didn't believe in curses. A seasoned backpacker, he had traveled to the region specifically for its untamed beauty and challenging trails. When a storm rolled in unexpectedly, he was forced to seek shelter, and the cabin was the only option for miles. The air inside was stale and cold. Dust blanketed the sparse furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. A fireplace stood against one wall, unused for years, and a single bed with a thin, moth-eaten mattress sat in the corner. Jake shrugged it off, setting up his sleeping bag on the bed. As night fell, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. Jake read by flashlight, the sound of the storm lulling him into a false sense of calm. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. He told himself it was the wind, but the sound came again, distinct and deliberate. It was a voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Help me." Jake sat up, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The cabin fell silent, save for the rain and the wind. Jake got up and searched every corner, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no one, just empty shadows. He returned to the bed, shaking his head. "You're imagining things," he muttered. The whispers began again. This time they were louder, overlapping, coming from all directions. Dozens of voices, pleading, crying, angry. The words were jumbled, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over, "Don't look under the bed." Jake's blood ran cold. He glanced at the bed, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispers grew more insistent, a cacophony of warnings. "Don't look! Don't look!" His rational mind screamed at him to leave, but a darker curiosity took hold. Slowly he knelt down, lowering the flashlight to the floor. The beam illuminated the dusty floorboards, and then a face. It was pale and bloated, its eyes black pits that stared unblinkingly at him. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, jagged teeth glinting in the light. Jake stumbled back with a shout, his head hitting the wall. When he looked again, the face was gone. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. Jake scrambled to his feet, grabbing his backpack and bolting for the door. But as he reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. It felt as though something was holding it closed from the other side. The voices returned, louder now, angrier. The walls of the cabin began to creak, the wood groaning as if the structure itself was alive. Jake pounded on the door, screaming, but the voices drowned him out. "Don't look! Don't look!" The floorboards beneath him shifted, and Jake felt something cold and slimy wrap around his ankle. He looked down and saw a hand, pale, skeletal, and dripping with black ooze, pulling him toward the bed. He kicked and thrashed, but the grip was unrelenting. As he was dragged closer, the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The last thing he saw, before the darkness consumed him, was the underside of the bed, a gaping void, blacker than the deepest night, filled with countless faces staring back at him. When the storm cleared the next day, hikers found Jake's belongings scattered outside the cabin. His sleeping bag, flashlight, and backpack were untouched, but there was no sign of him. Inside, the cabin looked unchanged, except for the bed. The mattress was gone, and in its place was a blackened, rotting hole that seemed to lead into the earth itself. No one dared to investigate. The locals added Jake's name to the growing list of those lost to the Hollow Point, and the warning remained the same: never look under the bed. The small town of Dunridge had always been surrounded by rumors of the Red Field. It was an expanse of farmland long left to ruin, overgrown with thorny vines and dry grass. The stories claimed that anyone who stepped foot on the field during the full moon would vanish, leaving behind only their shadow burned into the ground. For decades, no one dared to test the legend. But as time passed, curiosity grew, and some began to treat the tales as nothing more than an old wives' story. One night, on a dare from his friends, Lucas decided to see the field for himself. The night of the full moon was eerily bright, casting everything in an unnatural glow. Lucas drove his old pickup truck out to the edge of the field, the gravel crunching under the tires. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and the distant sound of crickets seemed muted. When he stepped out of the truck, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He scanned the field with his flashlight, but the beam didn't penetrate far. It was like the darkness of the field swallowed the light whole. "Just a dumb story," he muttered to himself, gripping the flashlight tighter. The field stretched out before him, a tangled mess of dry grass and weeds. At the center, he could just make out a strange discoloration in the soil, a deep red patch that stood out starkly against the pale ground. It was this red field that gave the place its name. Lucas took a deep breath and stepped onto the field. The air grew colder with every step he took, and the world seemed to fall eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling wind, just the sound of his boots crunching against the dry grass. He reached the edge of the red soil and crouched down, running his hand across its surface. It wasn't just dirt, it was grainy, almost like fine ash, and it smelled faintly of iron. Lucas frowned, wiping his hand on his jeans. He was about to stand when he noticed something, an imprint in the dirt, as if someone had been lying there. It was faint, but unmistakable. The shape of a person, arms stretched wide, legs slightly apart. His stomach tightened. It was as if the ground had preserved the outline of someone's final moments. Then he heard it, a faint, melodic hum carried on the still air. Lucas froze, his eyes darting around the field. The hum grew louder, richer, like a choir of voices rising in unison. It was beautiful and chilling all at once. Against his better judgment, he turned toward the sound. In the distance, figures were emerging from the darkness. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their forms faint and flickering, like shadows cast by a dying flame. As they came closer, Lucas realized they weren't walking. They had no feet, their lower halves dissolving into wisps of smoke. Panic gripped him, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the uneven ground. The figures continued their approach, their faces obscured, but their hollow eyes locked on him. Then the humming stopped. One figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, its presence commanding. Its shadowy form solidified, and for a moment, Lucas thought it looked like a person, a man in tattered overalls, his face weathered and lined. But then its mouth opened, impossibly wide, and a sound emerged that was anything but human. A deep, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate the very ground. Lucas turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The field seemed endless now, the grass tugging at his legs as if trying to hold him back. The figures gave chase, gliding silently across the ground, their eyes burning like embers. The truck was in sight, but as he neared it, the air grew thick, like trying to run through water. He gasped for breath, his lungs burning. Behind him, the moaning grew louder, closer. He threw himself into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. The truck wouldn't start. He turned the key again and again, his sweaty hands slipping on the ignition. Outside, the figures gathered, their faces pressed against the windows. Their eyes glowed brighter, illuminating hollow, rotted expressions. With one final twist of the key, the engine roared to life. Lucas floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The figures didn't move, but as he sped away, he caught a glimpse of the tallest one raising its hand, pointing at him. Lucas didn't stop driving until he was back in town. He stumbled into the diner, pale and shaking, his words incoherent. The locals didn't need to hear the full story. They knew where he'd been. The next morning, Lucas's truck was found parked at the edge of the field, its door open and the engine cold. There was no sign of him. But in the center of the red field, a new imprint had appeared in the soil. His silhouette, arms stretched wide, legs slightly apart. The locals don't talk about the red field anymore. They simply avoid it, especially on nights when the moon is full.